Now, the title under which I'm speaking is an incredibly broad one. It's thinking and acting morally. That's a very big topic. So I'm going to select a handful of things to talk about that are loosely related under the overall title of our conference. I'm going to talk about the Christian freedom to be a prophet. I'm going to talk about the Christian individual. I'm going to talk about why there's more to Christian morality than rights. And I'll finish up talking about behaving in public as a Christian, drawing on my own experience. So first of all, the Christian freedom to be a prophet. Like Fiona, I wasn't brought up in the church. And by the way, I know there's a prevailing story about the decline of the church in this country, but can I just point out that Fiona and I, we chose to join. And I'm sure there are many people in this room here who have chosen to join or who have chosen to remain. So it's not just a story about people leaving. So I wasn't brought up in the church. My maternal grandfather was a Methodist lay preacher. But when my mother left County Durham for marriage in southwest Scotland, she left her Methodism behind. My Scottish father's experience of church gave him an odd penchant for the electric organ, but that was about it. So when at the age of 12, I screwed up my courage and came out as a Christian, my father put his hand on my shoulder for the first and only time, and he said, "It's okay, son, it's just a phase." Now, as my Christian phase approaches its 7th decade, I find myself looking back and wondering what happened to me. What caused me to take that risk of stepping out, my first venture of exposed dissidence? Well, of course, there were people and there were institutions that helped. The Christian headmaster and mistress of my Ayrshire prep school, the summer crusader camps on the fabulous Dorset coast, and decisively an evangelical boarding school on the south side of Bath. These were all important in bringing my faith alive, but they were secondary because the flame of faith had flickered into life earlier and spontaneously. In 1961, I was 6 years old, and my father took me to the local Flea Pit cinema to see The King of Kings, the Hollywood film about Jesus narrated by Orson Welles. And evidently, I was deeply moved by this story of Jesus, this cinematic story of Jesus, because after returning home, I lay in my bed weeping. It's one of the very rare memories I have of my childhood. I lay in my bed facing the ceiling weeping, praying God to take the burden off Jesus and put it on me, which was, I grant you, rather ambitiously messianic for a 6-year-old. But here's the thing. I don't think anyone had taught me to pray. Looking back, I've observed that experience was the first in a series. Repeatedly, I found myself drawn to stories, not least in film form, of isolated dissidents who suffer for stubbornly speaking unpopular truths and whose integrity fascinates. So next in line, I guess in my mid-teens, was the famous story of Sir Thomas More, Henry VIII's Chancellor, who rather than sell his soul to his tyrannous master, suffered death by beheading in 1535. And I first met More in a classroom on the south side of Bath, reading Robert Bolt's remarkable play, A Man for All Seasons, which I've since revisited many times in the equally remarkable 1966 film starring Paul Scofield. If you haven't seen it, go see it. I encountered the third story in 1991 in a volume of wartime letters. The author was Helmut James von Moltke, great-grandnephew of Bismarck's greatest general, who was embarked on a high-flying legal career in Germany when Hitler came to power. Deeply opposed to Nazism and increasingly Christian, von Moltke organized clandestine meetings of the Kreisau Circle at his family estate during the war to plan for the radical reconstruction of Germany after her inevitable defeat. But Helmut James also worked in German military intelligence, where he strove to resist inhumane Nazi policies on prisoners of war and Jews. And in a letter to his wife on the 7th of March 1940, he described an unusually fraught day at the office. And I quote, "There was a big row, and I wonder whether they'll decide to throw me out at last. Once more, I was defeated on a decisive question. When the meeting was over, I asked permission to exercise the right of every official to have his dissenting opinion put on record. Big row. I was an officer, I was told, and had no such right, but simply the duty to obey. I said I was sorry, but this was a question of responsibility before history, which to me had priority over the duty to obey. The matter came before the Admiral Canaris, who was head of the section, and after 5 minutes, he endorsed my opinion. He obviously had shared it all along, at any rate had wavered, and my resistance had strengthened his courage. Result, the Admiral will have his personal dissent recorded in the minutes and will also speak to these minutes before Hitler." Note, von Moltke's standing out, his resistance, strengthened another's courage to stand out himself. In January 1944, Moltke was arrested for warning a friend that the Gestapo was watching him. A year later, he was tried, falsely implicated in the von Stauffenberg plot to assassinate Hitler, condemned to death, and hanged in January 1945 at the age of 38. I've twice driven from Berlin to von Moltke's family estate in what's now Poland. In 1995, I met his wife, Freya, not far from here, in the Westminster Abbey cloisters. And 15 or so years ago, I met his son in Oxford. The fourth tale of martyrdom that's impressed itself on me also occurred in the Second World War. It features Franz Jägerstätter, the peasant from the Austrian Alps, whose Catholic faith forbade him to swear an oath of loyalty to Hitler, leading him to the guillotine in August 1943. And his example captured me through Terence Malick's exquisitely harrowing 2019 film, A Hidden Life. As Robin alluded to, I've been embroiled in the culture war over Britain's colonial history. And I've had cause to ponder what it is that empowers some individuals to risk public dissent and what disables others. And the answer lies, I think, in where you locate your self-worth. For all of us, our self-worth lies somewhat in the eyes of other people, in our social status. Rare is the person who cares not at all what others think of them. Yet what distinguishes the prophet? And let me be clear here, I think all Christians are called to be prophets. You can't follow Jesus and not be one, maybe not all the time, but some of the time. What distinguishes the prophet is, ultimately, his sense of self-worth is not located in his social status or her social status. And this is very nicely illustrated in Robert Bolt's play A Man for All Seasons. At the play's beginning, We meet Richard Rich as a graduate fresh from Cambridge, looking for a job. But not just any job. Richard Rich wants to get his foot onto a ladder that will lead him to public prestige, ambition. So Rich hovers around Thomas More, pestering him for patronage. And eventually More relents and offers him a position as a teacher. Rich is crestfallen. More entreats him, why not be a teacher? You'd be a fine teacher, perhaps a great one. Sulkily, Rich retorts, and if I was, who would know it? More answers, you, your pupils, your friends, God. Not a bad public, that. What distinguished More was that for him, God was the ultimate public. As he declared on the scaffold, I die the king's good servant, but God's first. Fiona's point, playing to an audience of one. The same point emerges in A Hidden Life. Those around Jägerstätter are relentless in urging him to yield. So Jägerstätter refused to serve in the Wehrmacht. And his friends and his wife and everyone around him says, do you really think you'll change the course of history? Won't the world carry on just as before? Do you think anyone will notice your protest? You're just a peasant, an Austrian peasant. Will anyone remember it? Most of us didn't. The answer to these questions was given in the film's title, A Hidden Life, which alludes to the deeply Christian closing words of Middlemarch, George Eliot's famous Victorian novel, and these words appear at the end of the film. And they read, and I quote, "For the growing good of the world is partly dependent on unhistoric acts, and that things are not so ill with you and me as they might have been is half owing to the number who lived faithfully a hidden life and rest in unvisited tombs." Unlike Richard Rich, Jägerstätter was content with a hidden life of integrity and courage. He did not need to display his virtue. No virtue signaling here. So that those around him could see and approve and applaud. In the end, the only eye whose approval he coveted was God's, playing to an audience of one. But there's even more. In all these cases, faith in God's love is operative, and therefore the hope that even if faithful dissent costs life itself, it will not cost everything. At the end of Malick's film, we follow Jägerstätter into the room of execution. The camera turns and fixes our eyes on the guillotine. And then black darkness plummets down the screen. And it rests. But then the camera opens up onto a massive alpine waterfall, towering above us, superhuman in its sublime power, thundering and unstoppable. The reviving torrent of the water of eternal life. Jägerstätter's crucifixion of Good Friday has turned into his Easter resurrection. So the main point I want to make here is that our belief in God's love, our belief that God loves us, our belief that God's love will sustain us in death and beyond it, gives us such a sense of self-worth that we are able to stand up and stand out for what's true and what's right, even if the whole world doubts us and opposes us. Take Jesus' example. On the one hand, we see his intense, direct sense of the love of God, referring to God as Abba or Daddy. On the other hand, we witness his astonishing courage in challenging oppressive conventions, orthodoxies, and authorities. And the two are intimately related. His intense awareness of God's love sustained his courage to stand out and apart, as it should us all. It's often said that the Western exaltation of the individual is a fruit of the Enlightenment, the intellectual movement of the 18th and early 19th centuries. And this period is supposed to have involved the revolutionary repudiation of religious authority, dogma, and superstition in favor of the enlightened individuals following the dictates of his own reason. I think actually the Enlightenment is best viewed as a development, sometimes a distorted development, of certain elements of Christianity, rather than a simple throwing off of the Christian heritage. And this relates to my first point. The idea of the admirable, heroic individual standing out from the crowd and against prevailing convention has its earliest roots in the biblical tradition of the isolated prophet. In the very first book of the Bible, God calls Abraham out of his settled urban life in Ur of the Chaldees to become a migrant in a foreign land in order to generate a new godly nation. Later, God calls others to prophesy, to swim against the current, speak unpopular truths, and suffer the costs. So unpopular was the prophet Jeremiah, for example, that he was reduced to spending a night in the stocks. Fed up, according to chapter 20 of his biblical book, he complains to God thus: "You deceived me, Lord, and I was deceived. You overpowered me and prevailed. I am ridiculed all day long. Everyone mocks me. Whenever I speak, I cry out, proclaiming violence and destruction. So the word of the Lord has brought me insult and reproach all day long." But Jeremiah finds that he can't contain the truths he's been called to speak. And he continues, "But if I say, I will not mention his word or speak any more in his name, his word is in my heart like a fire shut up in my bones. I am wearying of holding it in. Indeed, I cannot." Observe this. Observe that if we take our cue from Jeremiah and Jesus, authentic individuality is not about mere self-expression. And this is the prophetic point. It's not about giving expression to our inner self, whatever on earth that is. I speak for myself, and if any of you are sinners, I speak for you too. The truth is that much of ourselves is not interesting, it's not attractive. So enough of this notion that authentic individuality is expressing ourselves, merely expressing ourselves. Much of ourselves are squandered. Biblical Christian individuality doesn't assume that the self is significant as such. It assumes that we make ourselves significant by becoming mouthpieces or embodiments of what's true and right, of responding to the call of God's word. As individuals, we matter, we gain weight, we gain significance insofar as we respond to and serve and become truths important for human salvation. What we say to others, they may find offensive, but our purpose is never to offend. Our purpose is merely to speak the truth. So at the heart of this biblical Christian understanding of what it means to be an authentic, genuine individual is not at all the self-obsessed, self-assertive, attention-seeking, virtually signaling ego. It's the subservient self, responsive to a higher moral order and the call of God to defend and promote what's good in the world. Christian individuals are not radically individualist. They are responsible individuals and standing in their service of what's true and what's good. And that relates to Monsignor Michael's earlier comment that human beings in the Christian vision are not originally radically free. And we only, as it were, acquire obligations as we consent to contracts. On the contrary, we are born into social obligations. And it's in meeting those obligations freely that we are fulfilled. And here's where I come to the issue of assisted suicide. And by the way, Robin, you said at the beginning that Parliament had voted to legalise assisted suicide. Not so. The House of Commons has voted a bill through, but in the course of debate in the Commons, that bill lost half of its majority. If only 12 MPs had voted against the bill rather than for it, it would have been killed. And some MPs, if you read Hansard, it's quite clear, some MPs, probably many of them, voted the bill through on the assumption that the Lords could sort out what they couldn't. Well, suppose the Lords can't. So yesterday, the House of Lords voted the bill into a select committee to hear evidence. And the process of debate will continue into next year, probably as far as the spring. And although some supporters of the bill had said that the Lords has no business obstructing a bill that the House of Commons has approved, other Lords have said, our job is to scrutinise this bill as much as it needs. And if the process of scrutinisation is not complete by the end of the parliamentary session, the bill will fall. We're not there yet, but not all is lost. Okay. So here's a brief remark about Christian individuality and assisted suicide. During the recent debate in the House of Lords, yesterday and a week ago Friday, several peers boldly asserted the individual's fundamental right to autonomy, fundamental right to determine when they die. And it wasn't appropriate, I didn't jump up and object, but I did object privately, and I said to myself, no, there is no such thing as a fundamental human right to autonomy. We're not fundamentally atomistic. We have no fundamental freedom. The issue of whether Parliament should grant a legal right to choose assisted suicide depends crucially on whether it's possible to do that without posing unacceptable risk to other people, the disabled, the elderly. In other words, individual autonomy should only be granted by the law insofar as it is compatible with our social obligations to other people, especially the vulnerable. From a Christian point of view, individual autonomy is always defined by social obligations. It is responsible autonomy. The individual is never simply free, but always burdened and dignified by social responsibility. So my next topic, again related, individual rights and Christian morality. So ages ago when I was preaching in Dublin, I tend to develop arguments. And I can go on for 50 minutes with an argument, but I was told by one of the congregants in Christ Church Cathedral, Dublin, most people can't cope with a 50-minute argument. They like blobs. So what I'm doing here is giving you a series of related blobs on related themes. So here's another blob on rights. As with the significance of the individual, so rights were not invented by the Enlightenment, with all due respect to what is popularly believed. Rights were not an invention of the Enlightenment. You can find the development of the notion of an individual having rights way back in medieval Christian thought. But in a Christian conception, legal rights are not the final moral word. Legal rights are subject to higher moral duties. And this is what's missing in contemporary discourse. Rights talk it dominates the board. Other kind of moral talk gets pushed off. Let me explain the issue in terms of an event that took place just over 10 years ago. On an innocent midweek January morning in 2015, two armed men burst into the Paris headquarters of the French satirical weekly Charlie Hebdo. Some of you will remember. They called for the editor-in-chief, Stéphane Charbonnier, to identify himself, and when they did, they shot him. They then proceeded to spend allegedly 10 minutes emptying their guns into other members of staff, and by the time they'd finished, 11 were dead and 11 others were wounded. The mass murderers were French citizens of Algerian parentage. They claimed to be members of the Yemeni branch of Al-Qaeda. Why did they do it? Charlie Hebdo is a militantly anti-religious newspaper in the French tradition of secularism. And in 2006, it republished the inflammatory cartoons of Muhammad that a Danish newspaper had published, one of which inserted a bomb under Muhammad's turban. And 6 years later, Charlie Hebdo published more cartoons of the Prophet, some depicting him nude. Now, while the Quran, Michael knows more about this than I do, while the Quran itself doesn't prohibit images of Muhammad, certain prominent and historic trends of Islam do regard all human images as idolatrous. So do some contemporary Muslims, especially members of alienated militant groups. So any depiction of the Prophet is regarded as blasphemous and deserving the death penalty. 2 days after the mass shooting, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula claimed responsibility, justifying it as revenge for the honor of Muhammad. Now, in the face of such an outrageous atrocity, millions of people in Paris, in France, and around the world poured onto the streets to demonstrate their support for Charlie Hebdo. And rightly so. No one deserves to be slaughtered merely for offending someone else. Not even when the offense is intended as an insult, it was in this case. Besides, and more deeply, the right to freedom of speech is precious. It allows us to testify in public to the truth of things as we see it. It lets us criticize what's customary and conventional and established, be they beliefs or practices or institutions. The right to freedom of speech permits us to prophesy. It makes possible the seeds of revision, reform, and progress. It enables individuals and societies to learn and maybe change for the better. So the legal right to free speech is important. And Charlie Hebdo journalists had the legal right to say things that other people, including Muslims, might find offensive. And that's as it should be. Notwithstanding the clamor of illiberal students for safe spaces, we shouldn't grant ourselves the right not to be offended, since sometimes what offends is the truth. And in that case, the problem lies with us, not with the offensive speech. In responding to Charlie's provocation with mass murder, the two French Algerians were unable to respect a well-justified legal right because they lacked the moral virtue of self-restraint. Yet, and this is, lots of people disagree with what I'm about to say, so you may too, but I'm going to say it. Yet, Charlie Hebdo's journalists also lacked the virtue of self-restraint. And that lack contributed to the violation of their right. Morally speaking, I think, and I speak as a Christian, morally speaking, no one should exercise their legal freedom of speech with the intention to cause offense. Why would anyone want to do that except out of hatred or contempt or glee at irritation or a reckless lust for a scrap? No, the only morally responsible reason for saying things that might offend is the duty to voice valuable truths that need to be heard. So, what we should intend, what we care about is the truth. We don't care to offend, though we might risk it. Even if we have a legal right to spit in other people's sacred cows for the sheer malicious fun of it, which Charlie Hebdo did, we have no moral permission. So in publishing their cartoons of Mohammed, what did Charlie Hebdo's editors intend? Did they intend to annoy and provoke and insult Muslims just for the sheer secularist pleasure of it? I think they probably did. I'm not saying they deserve to die, but they still shouldn't have done that, I think. They flaunted their legal right to be deliberately offensive. They neglected their moral duty not to be. Now, as I say, you may not agree with my judgment on that, but let me divert you from the illustration onto the main point, which is that in addition to legal rights, we also need citizens who exercise those rights well rather than badly, virtuously rather than viciously. We need citizens who have the qualities of character, the virtues that free them to do what moral duty requires. Because otherwise, the widespread moral abuse of legal rights will discredit them and generate pressure to restrict them or withdraw them altogether. So what I'm saying here is, rights talk isn't enough. Legal right is one thing. The virtuous, the moral use of those legal rights is another thing. We need duty talk and virtue talk as well as rights talk. And Christianity has long been alert to this. One of the matters that St. Paul treats on several occasions in his epistles to the early Christian communities in Corinth and Rome is the Christian's proper attitude toward Jewish law, especially the eating of pure or impure food given to idols. Now, Paul himself came to the view that religious faith in Christ permits the Christian to dispense with the requirement to adopt practices and customs prescribed under Jewish law. This represents the dimension of Christian freedom that protects people from compulsion and negative freedom from Jewish law. So under Jewish law, the eating of food given to idols is prohibited. Christians don't believe in idols, so we're free to eat food because it's just food. However, in addition to the freedom from Jewish law, there's also a much more important positive dimension, a freedom for love. So when considering the treatment of unnecessarily scrupulous Christians, those with a weak conscience, as Paul puts it, who don't feel free to dispense with Jewish law, Paul counsels their more enlightened, liberal brethren to restrain their use of freedom in order not to upset or offend or mislead their weaker brethren. So in other words, yes, he says, you enlightened Christians, you're quite right. I mean, you strictly speaking, left to yourselves, you can eat this meat. It's just meat, it's just food. But for the sake of your weaker, more fastidious brethren, even though you have a right to do it, you shouldn't, out of love for them. So again, the obligation of love constrains what we do with our right. And along the same lines, Paul addresses the Christian community in Rome, and he says, I'm convinced that nothing is unclean in itself. But if anyone regards something as unclean, then for that person it is unclean. If your brother or sister is distressed because of what you eat, you're not acting in love anymore. So let us therefore make every effort to do what leads to peace and mutual edification. We who are strong ought to bear with the failings of the weak and not please ourselves by not fully exercising our right out of love. So again, the point here is that whatever our rights, our exercise of them is subject to moral duties. And one of these duties, I think, is not to alienate other people needlessly by slaughtering their sacred cows for trivial or malicious reasons. And Christianity recognizes this as a duty of love. It recognizes that not everyone is characteristically disposed to be able to perform such a duty, and that the virtue of love needs to be cultivated. And most contemporary discourse in our world and the Western world, which is obsessed with rights talk, doesn't notice this at all. Christian behavior in public. So in recent years, somewhat to my surprise, I have found myself fighting for the right to free speech. And indeed, I'm chairman of the Free Speech Union. And I do so as a Christian. Since I believe that all humans are creatures and not gods, sinners and not angels, I take it for granted that our human grasp, our understanding of what's true and good, is often incomplete and often distorted. So in order to reach a better understanding, a better grasp, we do need to be free to challenge and test reigning orthodoxies, because if those orthodoxies are false, and if they misshape our schools and our workplaces, and the policies of our police and our government, then we all suffer. So we need the freedom to challenge prevailing views and call them to public account. We need the freedom to prophesy. And in that specific sense, it seems to me, Christians should be liberal. Now, I know that Christians often talk as if Christianity is here and liberalism is there. I'm not talking about liberalism. I'm talking about a certain respect in which we should be liberal, that is to say, pro-freedom, in terms of free speech. In that specific sense, Christians should be liberal, but if Christians should be liberal, liberals need to be Christian, using their legal right to free speech well rather than badly, virtuously, not viciously. In addition to fighting fighting for free speech, I've also found myself fighting the corner of reason. And since Christians are typically accused of being irrational, I take a lot of smug pleasure in this. And I find myself doing it mainly in relation to the public controversy over Britain's colonial history and over reparations. And my view of the, for want of a scientific term, of the woke advocates of decolonization and slavery reparations is that their claims run way ahead of the facts, way ahead of evidence. My view is that their personal and political passions so possess them they are driven beyond reason. And these passions render them unfree to respect and listen to critics such as me. So instead they resort to personal abuse, to smearing, misrepresentation, and political manipulation. Rather than reason, they resort to unscrupulous power. So how should a Christian, and I've thought about this a lot, how should a Christian respond to someone who appears impervious to reason? I first began to think about it, I suppose, 10 years ago, and I decided to read two autobiographies by members of the Irish Republican Army who had left the IRA, and two autobiographies of young British Muslims who had got involved in radical Islam and had left radical Islam. And when I was reading these autobiographies, what I wanted to know is, what changed your mind? Because at one point you were a zealot, and then at some point you decided to stop. What made you stop? I won't go into all the things I learned, but one lesson I drew from my reading was that however impervious someone might seem when you're talking to them, You should always spend some time telling them the truth as you see it, because you may lodge some pennies in there that over time will drop. And that, in the case of some of the people I read about, that's what happened. Someone spoke to them, said something that didn't accept it at the time, but it stayed in their mind, and eventually the truth dropped, and they changed, they repented. Surrounded as we are by a culture that tends to think that deep feeling is a mark of authenticity and truthfulness, I rebel. I prophesy. Feelings are liars, often. Feelings are liars, and they're being used as emotional bludgeons. Passion, in medieval Christian thought, was a bad thing. The word passion comes from the Latin verb, which means to be subject to be unfree, to be out of control. Tyler Robinson was no doubt very passionate about his killing of Charlie Kirk. That doesn't make it right. It makes Robinson obsessed, or even possessed. So not just as an academic, but also as a Christian, I consider my vocation to be that of trying to clarify moral situations by reflecting on them and marshalling reasons to venture a conclusion. Trust me, it's not that I don't feel, it's just that appeal to feeling or passion, or even compassion, doesn't tell us what's true or right. Or at least it does so in a partisan, blinkered fashion. So, for example, in the debate on assisted suicide, those who think that we should make assisted suicide legal, they elicit our compassion with stories of dreadful human suffering that could be relieved by assisted suicide. But as I said in the chamber, I said, compassion is a virtue, but it needs to look in more than one direction. Because over there are the disabled and the elderly who fear the unintentional effects of legalized assisted suicide. So being compassionate doesn't tell us what to do. Feeling's important, of course, but it needs to follow what's true and what's right, not determine it. So I find myself as a Christian fighting the corner of reason. Humble, responsible reason for sure, but reason nonetheless. Early on in my involvement in the culture war over colonialism, I found myself being sucked into rancorous spats on Twitter, as it was then. I confess I still am on Twitter. I know it's a risky business. Initially, I naively assumed that I was morally obliged to respond to anyone who addresses me. But of course, when I tried, I found the goalposts kept getting moved, and I got frustrated, and I got angry. But then it dawned on me that this wasn't a private exchange. The whole world was watching. Well, some of the world. And it dawned on me I had a lot more to lose than the person I was arguing with, my dignity and my reputation. So that's when I realized that when someone approaches you on Twitter or anywhere and begins by saying something provocative, gratuitously provocative or insulting, you know what? They don't want a conversation. They want a fight. They want war, and they want to keep on fighting it because that's what excites them. So I decided, no, I don't want to fight. And anyone who does that now, I just block. Not interested. In 2019, I ran a conference in Oxford under the title Academic Freedom Under Threat, What is to be Done? And one of the people attending the conference had been driven out of his academic career in the US because he challenged woke ideas on campus. And at the end of the conference, we asked him for his advice. And one pearl of wisdom he gave us was this: always remember, the room is not the room. Meaning, while you may feel as if you're arguing in a private space with the person in your face, he's not interested in being persuaded. So when you're speaking to him, speak past him to the audience, the bigger room. What's most important, this is really my point about behaving in public as Christians. What's most important is how you present yourself to the thousands who are watching. What matters at least as much as what you say is how you say it. How you say it. And remember, folks, people like me, I'm an academic, words are my thing. For most people, words are not their thing. But you can speak the truth by who you are, even if you can't articulate very well. And, Jesus wasn't an academic. Right? I have to admit that he wasn't an academic. But we embody the truth, and actually it's more important than words. We embody the truth and we show it. So whenever you're involved in a conflict, what you show may be more important than what you say. So, here I come toward a conclusion. I think one of the most important contributions that Christians can make to public controversy of any kind is to develop and exercise and model virtues that are vital in keeping controversy civil and reasonable, and not, as we have recently tragically seen, murderously violent. These are virtues such as courage in the face of ideas that are alien and even threatening, strict justice in representing what other people say, charity in construing their ambiguities, preferring the strongest to the weakest possibility. Let me explain that. Barack Obama, before he became president, was a barrister, an attorney. And whenever he was making a case, he always began it by scrupulously representing the case he was going to dismantle first, scrupulously. And where that case was ambiguous, he'd give it its strongest expression. Then he would dismantle it. Now that was powerful for two reasons, because by giving the opposing case the strongest expression, he was being charitable, he was being generous. So when he dismantled it, his dismantling was all the more powerful. Because he wasn't being mean, he was being generous to the opposition, and yet dismantled their case. So charity toward, not just justice, but charity toward other opinions. Docility, meaning teachableness, admitting the possibility that others might have something to teach us and we might have something to learn. Humility in admitting the possibility that we might need correction. Forbearance and temperance in the face of unfair provocation. And above all, such a love for the truth and what's right that we keep on saying it, we keep on embodying it, we keep on prophesying it in the face of hostility. These are all virtues, not skills, virtues. Not rights, not duties, virtues. We embody them. Now, these virtues aren't necessarily uniquely Christian, but they are genuinely Christian. They're not much talked about in our society now. They were in times past. Because, as I say, talk about rights has pushed everything else off the table. We talk about rights all the time. We don't talk about virtues. But the long tradition of Christian thought and practice talk about virtues. If you read the New Testament, you can't get past them. Love, faith, hope, patience. We need to re-inject talk about virtues into our culture. And it's by developing and displaying and naming virtues in the midst of the fractious culture wars, and other controversies, I think we Christians have a very, very important role to play in giving voice to them and reminding our fellow citizens of their vital importance for our life together. So let me just close by summarizing the four main things I've said, because I've said a lot, but there are four main things. First of all, I've said that belief in God's love for us is what gives Christians the courage to be prophetic, to sacrifice the approval of those around us in daring to speak the truth, which might be unpopular, even offensive. Second, I've said that significant, weighty, worthwhile individuality is not achieved by simply expressing our inner selves. It's achieved by heeding God's call to serve what's good and true with the talents and opportunities given us in our own particular circumstances. Genuine individuality is morally responsible individuality. Third point was that while legal rights to various kinds of freedom, say of speech, are important, rights are not enough. We are subject to God-given duties to use rights well rather than badly. Rights talk is not enough. We need duty talk and virtue talk too. Fourth and finally, when behaving in public, how we Christians say things is quite as important as what we say. And in a time when public controversy tends to degenerate into unrestrained abuse, even murderous violence, we Christians have an enormously important role to play in embodying and modeling the virtues that keep the public temper civil. Thank you very much.